From Glean Education, this is Ed Leaders in Literacy, a podcast series that features educators and administrators who have made hard decisions about instruction, curriculum, intervention, and school systems to close the achievement gap and build equity by improving literacy. I'm Jessica Hammond, founder of Glean Education, and on the show today is Lacey Robinson, the Chief Executive Officer of UnboundEd. Admired and respected for her contributions in education, Ms. Robinson is a passionate former teacher, school leader, and widely sought after keynote speaker. Her life's work aims to eradicate a student provision gap still predictable by race. Lacey, it is such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm super excited.
You are so accomplished as a leader in the education space. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in education to begin with, and orient us to what inspired you to work as a change agent for educational equity?
Yes. Well, I think my story actually starts with my experience going to school. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, Dayton and Akron, Ohio. And I, upon my parents, around the age of 5 or 6, upon my parents getting a divorce, we moved to a community where my sister and I were one of the 2 families of color in the neighborhood. So we essentially integrated the neighborhood. And as a little girl, I had no perception or even understood what that meant. I just knew that I clung to my sister's side as we walked to school, and oftentimes either walking to school or walking home, we fell victim to taunts and sort of harassment from the neighborhood's kids. And in school, I knew that I was an anomaly because I was either always the only child of color or only the Black child in a classroom. And so, and yet, I knew I loved to learn. Like, there was this thing that I craved to always want to know more, whether it was always asking questions or looking through books. And I would say, in my first grade year, my mother noticed I struggled with learning how to read. She knew the previous year as a kindergartner, I could not grasp the alphabet. I struggled with memorizing the letters and the sounds. And she often talks about walking into my bedroom during my kindergarten year and listening to me in my sleep saying the alphabet or going over the sounds. And it would just like break her heart that, like, even when she's sleeping, she's still trying to digest the letters and the sounds. But I got passed on to first grade, which was a little signal to my mom. Like, if she's struggling so much to read and reading so foundational, why isn't anyone stretching to help her? And so I got passed on to first grade, and I struggled through first grade. And so to be a child of color, the only child of color in a classroom, in an entire school, in an entire neighborhood and community, and to struggle in your learning, it starts to grow this, what I call a pebble, then a pearl, then a rock, then a boulder feeling that you have, that you are not worthy, that you are not counted, that you are not fully human, if you are constantly being put on the outside of things and being made fun of. And so my mom often talks about the stress she knew my sister and I were under living in a neighborhood and going to a system that was predominantly white. And yet she made that decision because at the time in Dayton, Ohio, there was a lot of white flight in the communities of color. And we know that historically, when white flight happens, then comes the onset of redlining communities, and it just starts this tumultuous wave of inequalities. And oftentimes those inequalities first show up in schools. And so she felt like she didn't have a choice. I have to sacrifice their psychological well-being so that they can learn to read, write, be mathematicians, scientists, and grow their curiosity about learning. And so as a child, kindergarten, first grade, tons of talks, tons of while my mama's doing my hair, like, you don't listen to what they say. You go in and you learn. And despite what the teacher does and does not do, you grab as much as you can. And when you get home, we're going to go over it, because you're brilliant. And so in the first grade, they wanted to pass me on second, still couldn't read, still couldn't recognize letters. And my mother said, enough. I'm not doing it. I am holding her back, whether you want me to or not. And let me tell you something, that was a miracle decision, because that very next year, I got a teacher by the name of Miss Montgomery. Miss Montgomery was the loveliest woman I had ever seen. She smelled like oatmeal cookies. And Miss Montgomery not only took the time out, along with a co-teacher of hers, another teacher that was across the hall, her name was Mrs. Littleton. They decided that Miss Montgomery was going to spend my reading time really getting me into phonics, learning the code. And Miss Littleton after school was going to continue to tutor me. And Miss Montgomery did something extraordinary. That was the same year that Jane Elliott's Bluest Eye began to catch back on. She had done it in the 70s. This was the early 80s, and it was coming back up again. And unbeknownst to me, as a second-time first grader, Miss Montgomery took this, what I call extraordinary, challenge. And she did the Bluest Eye experiment with us first graders. She divided the class up. If you're blonde hair, stand over here. If you're brown hair, stand over here. If your skin is this color, stand back here. And she used the entire day to do the Bluest Eye experiment. For the first time in my little life, I felt human in school. I watched as some of my classmates cried because she told them they couldn't eat lunch because they had blue eyes. I watched as the same little boys that taunted me were in the corner kicking the wall because she told them that they couldn't use a pencil because they had brown hair. And I don't want to say that I reveled in their misery. But what happened was, for the first time, I felt that they connected with my pain. And it changed my year. And it changed who I was as a student. And it changed me to have the audacity to push back and say, I belong here. So that's where I think my love of education, my activism, all of that got, the start button was pressed that second time around in first grade.
And then what brought you into teaching specifically? So that was a very powerful kind of educational experience that was social, emotional, and academic, and wrought and inspiring. But what guided you toward the teaching?
Yeah, I would say two things. First, there's a scene in one of my favorite movies, The Color Purple. When it premiered, my mama dressed us up, marched us down to the theater. We had moved to Akron, Ohio by then. And there's a scene where Celie's sister, Nettie, is teaching her to read. And she's put words all over the kitchen. And they're sounding the words out. And I could feel that little first grader in me. Like that scene in that movie, just this spark. And I was just like, I want to do that. I want to know what that feels like, to know that you're teaching someone something, and like the joy and the power at the same time that came across in that scene. And so I left that movie determined to teach my grandmother how to read. Now, it wasn't anything that was said in our family. Like, no one went around saying grandma couldn't read. But I knew that she struggled reading her Bible, and she had a Bible that had pictures in it. I also knew that the religious community that she was involved in, they were teaching her how to read. And so I would bring my little self and I'd sit next to her and I'd help her sound the words out like they helped me sound out the words. And that was my spark of teaching. Now, my mother will tell you, I told her I wanted to be an actress, a star, a broadcast, a weather woman. And my mom would just sit there and listen. I want to be a writer. I had all of these like huge accolades. And my mother said the whole time she knew, she's going to be a teacher. So by the time I got to college, I went to a HBCU, the Florida A&M University. And I had decided, okay, you know what? I'll try this teaching thing. I'll placate her for a while until I get found as a star. And then it like bit me. It bit me. Learning about how to learn at the same time being in an HBCU, and for the first time in my life, learning about the African-American history in the United States and like who my ancestors were and the possibilities. And this is going to sound really crazy, but I am, for the first time in my life, as a college student. Now, I grew up in Akron, Ohio. Everything in Akron, Ohio at the time was black and white. You were either black or you were white. It did not matter your ethnicity, your nationality. You were either black or you were white. And I remember landing on campus and there were people of color from California and the Bahamas and Arizona, Utah, and they had different accents, and they liked rock music. And it was like this cornucopia of people of color. And I was amazed that people of color were not what I was always grounded in, the same. So that also propelled me to want to give that glimpse, that window to students. Because I knew inevitably students of color, particularly in marginalized neighborhoods, were getting that same message I got. You're all the same. You're not counted. We don't really see you. We don't see you until you assimilate. So that was the other thing that fueled me to want to get in teaching. And then I would say my experience in my residency at the Marva Collins Preparatory School in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now that was the rocket ship, because I walked into that building that was run by Mrs. Mims, who I think has since passed, God rest her soul. I walked into that building the first day and she had me observe a second and third grade class. And the thing about the Marva Collins School was Marva Collins was advocate at the time that I now know for the science of reading. She knew that in order for students to grasp, to become literate, they had to be taught the code. They needed to know the foundational pieces for reading. And so those teachers started with their kids in kindergarten. It was a requirement. You started as a kindergarten teacher with your class and you matriculated up with them all the way up to 5th grade, and then you dropped back down. She wanted every single teacher in that building to be skilled in the science of reading. That was the only way you could make it. And so when I went to observe this second and third grade class, I talk about this. I walked in on that first day, and these were all students in Cincinnati, Ohio, whose parents had removed them out of the public school, or they had been kicked out of the public school. Can you imagine that by 2nd grade? Like, what have you done? And so the class was about maybe, I would say 35 to 36 children. It was packed. And I walked in and she was standing in front of the class. She wasn't standing, she was sitting on a stool, and they were reading Animal Farm. I almost screamed. I mean, I was like, surely that's not what I think it is. And she's reading from the text, and there's a scene where the horse is talking. I remember I got flashback to 9th grade, and I was like, oh my God. And then she started calling on the students to read the text. And I started crying. I had to get up and walk out of the class because I had never seen children in such brilliance, like Black children in such brilliance. And
just sitting, actually, what's the truth of it is sitting in their real potential.
yes.
And it shatters the belief gap that is present and that is so harmful. And
Yes.
that is incredibly powerful, and sad that we don't see it more often.
No.
No. So you left that moment, and where do you go from there?
I'd say it was a lot of grace and blessings. I left Marva Collins. I taught in Georgia for a few years. I had some friends who were from New York, and I had traveled overseas right after I graduated, and I fell in love with Paris. Couldn't afford it. But I had friends in New York who were like, you should move to New York. And I was like, oh, New York's kind of like Paris. And I was like, but what am I going to do in New York? And they were like, why don't you go to Columbia University's Teachers College? And I was like, what is that? Because I will tell you, as an African-American student, we don't always get all of the information about the programs and schools and colleges and possibilities. Maybe because regionally, maybe because no one ever took the time. And she was like, oh, it's Teachers College. You never heard of Teachers College? I was like, I didn't even know they had a Teachers College. So I was like, I'll apply. Well, my GPA was so high at Florida A&M. By the way, I have to say this. I graduated high school with a 1.97. I got to college and never went below a 3.5. And by the time I graduated, I was a 4.0.
Yep. Same experience here.
Nurturing and expectations and high expectations. So I apply and I get in. They were like, you don't even have to take the graduate exam. So I moved to New York. I'm sitting in class with a professor who was well known. And I'm getting upset by what she's saying in terms of students of color learning language. And everyone's sitting there taking notes because she's, honored and admired in the education field. And they're taking notes.
Do you care to mention who it is? Or
I mean, it's going to be provocative, but I will tell you, it was Lucy Calkins' class. And she made a statement about teaching Black students the money language. And I was like, the money language? She talking about dollars and cents? Like, what do you mean the money language? She was talking about standard English. And so that little first grader in me, who had gone to college,
had come right back in that classroom.
I was livid. I was like, I literally stood up and was like, what are you talking about? I didn't know Lucy Calkins. I didn't know anything about the writing project. I didn't know anything about the writing process. I couldn't tell you who she was. And I guess me sparring with her struck her, because I remember she called me up after class and asked me if I was interested in working with her. And I was like, were you just here? Did you?
Very
and I later to learn that Lucy admires. She's not the kind of intellect that she wants to be sparred with, at least at that time. And so that's what introduced professional development to me. That was my first time ever even knowing there was actually a job like that in education. I was in graduate school, so I had opportunity to learn from Linda Darling Hammond, Ken Burns. Like, I was just plopped in the midst of, I was introduced to Lisa Delpit. And so all of that, plus working with the writing project, going out into schools, teaching them readers and writers workshop, it just propelled me to want to continuously lift educators up. Because I knew that ultimately what I found is that the more nurturing you give to the teachers, that some of that nurturing gets poured into students, but there was always something missing. And it wasn't until I got to Montgomery County schools that I was introduced to race and equity work in education, and realized that even if you give teachers the information, the pedagogy, the know-how, the content knowledge, if their bias lens is intact, it's still going to be withheld from the students of color. And so working in Montgomery County schools, being an equity specialist, I spent 3.5, 4 years grounding myself in some of the formative work in race and equity and anti-racism, Alfred Tatum, Beverly Tatum, Gloria Ladson Billings, folks that I had heard in my HBCU, but now I was taking their work and applying it to teacher professional and leader professional development. And so that's been my track. I left there, became a middle school turnaround principal with new leaders.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that experience. I had heard about your work as a turnaround specialist, and I'm curious, did that come after your work as an equity specialist? And if so, did you find that you still had any kind of beliefs that needed to be disrupted in order to support that work?
Oh, man.
Even having been an equity specialist, even having experienced inequities and racism in your life.
Yep. I will tell you that that was proof that it doesn't matter how much you study it, until you are in it and facing it and continuously raising your conscious level up, you will inhale the smog of racism and go right back to your habits of actually rebirthing it. And so as a turnaround principal, I mean, I have deep regrets. I have deep regrets of what I accepted from a system that was predominantly people of color. I will tell you that. In a predominantly people of color community.
Well, and isn't that the very root of systemic racism?
Yes.
It doesn't just affect one group. It's systemic among everyone in the system.
Yes. And if you have white colleagues and coworkers and leaders who themselves have not faced their own biases, well, they along with you will perpetuate it, right? Because it just is the way things are. And so the day that I was handed my keys to my building, I wasn't told to raise the 18% literacy rate, 18% proficient, 23% proficient in math for the 7th and 8th graders, 978 of them. That's not what I was charged to do. They chuckled as they passed me the keys and told me to get the murder rate down in the building. And there was this picture painted of those students in that community that I was going into war. And not that this was a community that had been marginalized and that had not been given the appropriate support, or even recognizing that everyone had lost hope and possibility of what those students in that community could do. And so I was put on guard, and I was told that I was being watched closely, right? And so I went in with my guard up and wanting to prove not just to the leaders, but to the students that, like, you're more than this. And unfortunately, I did not allow my anti-racist, my anti-bias antenna to remain up, because fear took over, which is another fallout of systemic racism. And it predicated all of my actions. And I so wanted the students to model assimilationist values, postures like I did, because that's how I made it, that I had moments quite often that I forgot to see them for who they were and the beauty that they were bringing into the building. And as I got to know them, I would see their brilliance. Like, we looked at our SPED count and it was nowhere near what they were saying. You know, and I would say, say that again.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say by the second year, when we entered the building, there were 978 students, and the previous year there were 1,000 suspensions. So there were more suspensions than there were students.
Wow.
And like I literally asked, were you guys suspending the teachers too? Like, what is? And by the second year, our suspension rate had dropped so far down. And we weren't removing students from the building. We were keeping them in the building, even if they had violated, you know, a norm or a rule. But I would say even in that moment, I still struggled with seeing them for who they were and trying to prove, and all that information I had about anti-racist work.
Can you paint us a quick picture of one student that pops out for you that you can kind of put this to a face for us?
Yeah, so it's my student that I talk about, who of course I changed his name, that I had my first year. His name was Dominique. And prior to the building opening, Dominique was one of the students listed on this list that I got of just being just this notorious student. He was repeating 8th grade for the second time. He had broken a teacher's arm the year before. He was just touted as just being this terrorist of the building. And they were bringing him back for the next year. And so the first day of school, I built my entrance, how the kids were entering school, based off of how I wanted to handle Dominique. I made all the kids line up outside, uniforms on. I had my entire leadership team and my staff stand at the door. It was like prison. They looked over all the students, made sure the uniforms were on, looked them in their eyes, shook their hand. You're not going to cause us any trouble. So I'm standing there next to my AP, and up walks this lanky, I mean, he was just so skinny kid, and he could barely look at me. His eyes kept looking down. He looked really shy. He had on this huge belt buckle, and we shook his hand and I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "I'm Dominique." And I was like, "No, you can't be Dominique. Not no." In my head, I'm like, "Not the monster they painted in picture for, for you." Like, and I shook his hand and I said, "Dominique, you're gonna have a good year." And he's like, "Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am." And Dominique came in. We had all gendered classes. We had switched that around, all boys, all girls, and he flew. He turned out he loved ELA. He loved social studies. He loved science. He was adventurous. I would make him come to my office every day because I was going to stay on top of Dominique. We would have lunch and we would actually have this intellectual conversation about like what he wanted to do and how he wanted to join the armed forces. And he liked to jump off of buildings because he wasn't afraid of heights. And like, wow. I got to know him. And I looked up one day and I hadn't seen him for a couple of days. And I called. And his uncle answered the phone. He said, "Dominique's has been sick and we're not sure what's going on." A couple days go by. I made up my mind I was going to go to his house. And I'm standing in the building one morning and I'm watching this man carry what I thought was a toddler into the building. And the closer he got, I recognized it was Dominique. He had lost so much weight. He looked like a toddler. And in this very weak voice, he said, "Miss Robinson, I came to get my homework." So turns out Dominique had a brain tumor. All those years before when he was causing disturbances in the building, it was because of the brain tumor.
Wow.
When he broke the teacher's arm, he was in a massive migraine spiral because the tumor was growing. And he was trying to get out of the classroom to go to the bathroom and she put her arm up.
Wow.
And it was simply because the surgeons told us, the family let us in on the medical and all that. They said this could have been operable, but because they didn't know, and the parents were like, "We didn't have health insurance. We didn't know we could take him to the doctor." Literally not having enough information and not having health insurance killed this young man. I had a co-principal at the time. We helped pay for the funeral and I helped give the eulogy. Dominique taught me a really hard lesson that all those years I spent learning about anti-racist work, that if I wasn't careful, if I wasn't mindful, I would slip back into that system and cause the same conditions that quite frankly killed him. And so he sticks out. I carry him with me pretty much everywhere I go. I have a lot of guilt because he represents the moment where I had it with me all the time and I didn't use it. And so that's part of and I would say our call at UnboundEd is that we work diligently at naming what I call the thing, talking about systemic racism, pointing out how if your lens aren't acute, if you don't have your anti-racist, anti-bias lens on, you literally will regenerate segregation, systematic racism in your instruction, just in your instructional moves. White, Black, it doesn't matter. We all inhale this smog and we will exhale it back into the environment if we're not careful.
I first heard about your work through a YouTube video, actually, where you're talking about the anti-literacy laws of the 1700s and 1800s. And if I can, I just want to play a very quick clip of a keynote speech that you gave where you were talking about that.
Sure.
(1847), Missouri prohibited teaching Blacks to read or to write. Yes, this is history, but I'm here to tell you that this history has a legacy, and this legacy has legs, and those legs walk into your school, and they predict your practices and your policies and your beliefs around building literacy for children of color.
So that is very moving and so important to really understand the root of it, that the foundation of America, the foundation of America's education system is rooted in racist policies that build upon what we have now. And we don't see that we can't change it. If we're not aware of it, we can't do anything about it. So can you tell us about what UnboundEd is doing to support teachers in growing their awareness of this understanding, and what teachers can do to grow their own awareness and then become change agents?
Yeah. Well, I say first and foremost, we are committed to really building this collective community that we have high regard. I think that the societal view of what an educator is in the United States has got to greatly change. We don't treat educators as who they truly are. They are practitioners who are in the business of thinking, and they're in the human development business. And so what we try to do at UnboundEd is honor our educating community by first and foremost gathering them, which is where our Standards Institute, where you will find now over 1,000, couple of thousand educators twice a year come together. We sit for 5 days and we do what we make our brain sweat around our intersection work. And this is where aligned curriculum, content, pedagogy, and equity all merge together. And we say equity with a big E. We don't mean just using equity sticks to call everyone's name. It's not heroes and holidays. It is the recognizing how our systematic racist policies, practices, procedures, and mindsets can actually predicate what we do in those discretionary moments, what lessons we offer up for students of color, the levels of possibilities that rise and fall with our own sort of predicated theories and assumptions about students of color or marginalized students. And so we bring all that together and we ask folks to study that in ELA and math and in leadership. And then we try to continue this conversation because we realize 5 days is not enough. And actually in those 5 days, we can shift their mindset and their heart sets that will eventually start to predicate their actions. But we know that 5 days isn't enough. And oftentimes people leave and they're geared up and they're ready to go and they get back to their buildings and guess what? The smog is there. And they start to, diminish. They know what they should do, but if the policies aren't there, if the leadership doesn't have it. And so we started our cohort programs to hope to, I would say, nurture system leaders along with building leaders. That's the only way you can get into the program, is if a district comes or a CMO comes and says, we have system leaders and building leaders, teachers, APs, coaches, lead teachers, along with CAOs, assistant superintendents. And they sit shoulder to shoulder with us for an entire year and they dive into that intersection. And we ask them in the very beginning, we use People's Institute or Racial Equity Institute. We sit 2 days in that, undoing racism and how it manifests in our society and our personal lives. Then we take that undoing racism and we apply it. We deepen their knowledge about the content of ELA and math. And then we ask them to fold them together and then go back into their buildings and to begin to look at where the manifestation of the systemic racist policies, practices, and procedures starts to bubble up. Sometimes it's very obvious, right? Like, well, we don't have an aligned curriculum. Not every student is getting access to grade level work. We're not prepping our teachers deeply enough. Or sometimes it's not as obvious, like othering. So I have bilingual students in my classroom and I don't honor them acquisitioning into a second language. In fact, I try to diminish their home language, thinking that I am increasing them learning standardized English. And so we ask them that when those things pop up as leaders, to start to reconfigure those things in their buildings. And starting with instruction, we find levels the playing field for everyone, right? It forces them into the technical move of eliminating racism. But we all know that you can't just technically move stuff. You have to move into the adaptive. So our cohort programs, we sit shoulder to shoulder. Now that COVID has happened, of course, we can't meet in person, but we are on next week. We'll be launching our 3rd virtual summit, where we've taken our 5 days and condensed them down to 2 days, if you can believe it, virtually, where we get right to the how. So how do I do this in my classroom?
Do you have an example of an organization or district you've worked with that has exemplified this change and has, a good story out of it that you could share?
Yeah, I have several. I think one of the things that pops out of my head is Iberville. It's a small town that's outside of Baton Rouge. I'm trying to think, we had to take a ferry to get there. I believe we might have had to take a ferry to get there. And there is a building leader there by the name of Emily Martin, who was in our first cohort of SLAs and EIRs. And so I remember the look on Emily's face when she first started with us. It was kind of like deer in headlights, not quite sure. And so she had come to Institute, she'd come to some of our virtual sessions, but now it's time for us to go and walk her building, okay? And we go in and we start observing her class. Now, the system had adopted an aligned curriculum, okay? But without the knowledge or understanding of unpacking the standards, which is one of the things we stand on, they kept saying to us, like, we adopt this aligned curriculum. We don't understand, like, why we're not seeing results. It doesn't feel like the teachers are really getting at. And in the observation, along with the superintendent, because she invited him along, because she started to understand that I have got to institute some sort of power and get folks lined up, we discovered that the curriculum they had adopted was built out of the anchor standards. And none of the grade 7th, 8th grade teachers had an opportunity to unpack their grade level standards. So if I'm teaching a lesson and it's based off of the anchor standard, I don't have the very broken down stage that my students should be in right now in 7th grade, the staircase of complexity that the standard offers. I'm not quite sure where I'm getting them to go.
Yeah.
And so that was one thing. And then I will say, Emily herself, her adaptive, that was a technical, right? Because the system actually changed curriculums because of that, because of her and her advocacy and acknowledging that. But then I would say Emily, after matriculating on the program, came back and has started facilitating with us. And this last winter, she was very distracted. I could tell. I'm like, Emily, what's going on? And she said to me, there's a student they're trying to expel, and he's almost done. And I am fighting for this African-American male not to be expelled. He is almost done with his high school track. And I just know that if we expel him, he will continue this generational, miseducation and wealth gap. And so she fought tooth and nail, and she convinced them to keep him. And months later, she came back to me and she said, Lacey, he graduated. He is a welder now. He got a job that has completely now changed his trajectory of wealth. And she said, I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't gone through the cohort program.
Wow. Yeah. And that's just one situation. Yep. Thank you for sharing that. What about with all that's happening right now with COVID closures? I think we're seeing, or maybe more people are being made aware of the inequities that were deeply embedded in our system to begin with. But with the shakeup, people are now seeing it anew. Do you have any thoughts or advice in terms of tackling some of the inequities that are arising out of these COVID closures, and how, teachers, even parents, can move forward in thinking about the inequities before them and changing that?
Yep. Well, I would say first and foremost, what I call the beauty and the ashes of all of this is that we as a nation, when we sheltered in place in our communities, didn't even realize that we were gathering as collective communities, and we had to rely on one another in a way that we had not done, I would say, for decades, right? And so in that collectivism, right, parents and teachers and leaders had to fold into this relationship where they over communicated, shared, I would say, the role of educating their students in a way that we have been wanting and looking for on all sides, right? It's particularly parents of color. I want to be informed by my teachers. I want to know how I can help my students. And yes, I might work 2 jobs, but that doesn't mean I don't care about my child's educational trajectory, right? And from teachers, I want to connect with my parents, and I know they're busy, and it may seem like to me at times that they want to be disassociated from their child's educational track, but like, I need them to partner with me. This forced us to find ways to do that.
Yeah.
And so my first and foremost, I would say, call out to folks is like, let's hold that to be our true North Star. There are systems right now who are grappling with the percentage of students and families who they've had no contact with since this distant learning and COVID crisis. And I'm asking them to stop and ask yourselves, how well did you nurture those relationships? How did you open your schools and your communities? Did you meet them where they are? Mm-hmm. Is there an expectation that they enter your buildings wearing certain things and speaking a certain way and holding themselves? Or do you literally open up the door and say, come one, come all, so we can do this together? Don't make assumptions about our parents. First of all, don't make assumptions that parents don't care about their kids. I don't know anybody that wakes up every day and says, I want to try and make my child's life as hard as possible because I don't want them to get ahead or be better than me. Mm-hmm. And parents aren't teachers. We have taken the time out to study what it means to be an educator. So stop trying to turn them into teachers and turn them into co-creators. Mm. Give them the tools, give them I would say, the support, so that they can better understand, where's my student right now? Where are they supposed to be? Where are they going? And how can I nurture that? Mm. And then I think this is a time where we as an education community and we as a society have to come to a reckoning. We have to change our perception of what it means to be a teacher. We're not magicians. We're not some celestial beings. You know, we go out of our way because of the love that we have for our students and learning and community. But we need support and resources. And that doesn't always mean, yes, I need laptops and computers and Wi-Fi and materials, but I also need to support on continuing to grow. I need to be able to learn more than what I had when I got into this profession. And I need to be able to have the right tools and research and theory and conversations on how to meet my students where they are, academically, culturally. So, you know, I'm hoping, and I'm hearing this now, we hear lots of systems now saying professional development now more than ever has really started to stick out. We really need to get grounded in it. And as long as we can captivate everyone's attention right now through their computer, through their Zoom, we can continuously give them that professional development that they need. And then I would say, above all things, we have to recognize how systemic racism and bias has played out in our school buildings, in our policies, our practices, and our procedures, and how we define what it means to learn in the United States and who gets to learn in the United States. And so I'm hoping that all these conversations that are circulating start to turn into beliefs and actions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that sounds like the framework for an op-ed I'd like to read in the New York Times or the Atlantic. So, Lacey, it is beyond a pleasure to learn from you today and listen to your thoughts on education and equity. So thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about Lacey Robinson and the great work she's doing at UnboundEd, you can visit their website at unbounded.org or follow Lacey Robinson on Twitter at LACROB or at UnboundEd.edu. Thanks again, Lacey.
Thank you, Jessica.
What a pleasure.
That was fun.